Sense Pleasures and Sensuality. August 13, 2022. Vivikeva kame, vivika akusalehi, dhammahi. Secluded from sensuality, secluded from unskillful qualities. That's the beginning of the Buddha's description of the first jhana. To get the mind into right concentration, you have to seclude your mind from sensuality. This doesn't mean that you have to uproot sensuality, simply that you put sensual thoughts aside. Sensuality and sensual pleasures are not the same thing. Sensuality is your fascination with thinking about sensual pleasures. We like to fantasize about sights, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile sensations, all the narratives that go around lust, the narratives that go around our desire for food, how you want to fix the food, how you want to eat the food, or the great meals you've had in the past. Sensual craving is actually craving to fantasize about sensual matters. The mind has free range. The world itself offers only a limited number of sensual pleasures compared to the huge variety that the mind can think of. The pleasures themselves and the sensuality are both a challenge in the practice. They challenge in different ways, and you deal with them in different ways as well. Starting with sensual pleasures, the Buddha said, we don't try to weigh ourselves down with pain. We're not here just to do without. But, he said, if you notice there's a pleasure where, when you indulge in it, unskillful qualities increase and skillful qualities decrease, you've got to step back from that pleasure. You've got to deny yourself that pleasure because it's going to be bad for your mind. After all, there are some sensual pleasures that are actually good for the practice. A nice quiet place, natural surroundings, a harmonious community, these all count as sensual pleasures, and they're actually very positive supports for the practice. There are others pleasures, though, that will depend on the individual. For some people they're no problem, for others, they're big problems. A good way to test your ability to do without sensual pleasures is to take the 8 precepts, because the precepts that get added onto the 5 are basically matters of sensory restraint. The rule against eating after noon places some restraint on your tongue. The rule against watching shows places restraint on your eyes. The rule against wearing cosmetics and perfumes, restraint on your nose. Listening to music, restraint on your ears. Lying on beds that are not luxurious or high, restraint on your body. The rule against sexual intercourse of any kind, restraint on all your senses. See how you handle these kinds of restraint. Some people have real difficulties, others find it relatively easy. This is a typical practice for the Uposatha days, the days of the full moon, new moon, and half moons, when, in Thailand and other Theravadan countries, people take the day off, go to the monastery, and spend the day there meditating. These precepts, by limiting the pleasures of the senses, are really good for focusing you on where you really need to be focused, which is finding pleasure and concentration. So with sensual pleasures, it's a matter of selective restraint. With sensuality, though, it's a matter of trying to escape from it entirely. First, you have to see the drawbacks of that kind of thinking. When the Buddha was giving his graduated discourse, the step-by-step discourse to get people ready for the 4 Noble Truths, that would be the turning point. He would start with a talk on generosity, a talk on virtue, a talk on heaven. Heaven, of course, would be a description of the pleasures you could experience up there based on the fact that you'd been generous and virtuous down here. But then the talk would turn. He would say that actually there's a downside to sensuality. He called it not only the drawbacks, but also the degradation of sensuality, the fact that the mind becomes a slave to its sensuality and gets nothing of any value out of it. The Buddha gives lots of images to get you to think about the drawbacks of sensuality. First, there are the examples. It's because of sensuality that we have to work hard to find the money for sensual pleasures. We gain the money, and who knows if we can actually keep it. It's because of sensuality that people get into fights, husbands with wives, parents with children, brothers with sisters, and from there it heads out to wars between nations. People commit crimes based on sensuality, and many of them get caught and have to be punished. The canon has a very long and graphic description of the gruesome tortures meted out to criminals in those days. On top of the drawbacks in the present life, it's because the mind is overcome with sensuality that it ends up doing things that pull it down, leading to a bad rebirth. Then there are the images and similes of the drawbacks of sensuality. As the Buddha said, even if it rained gold coins, we wouldn't have enough for our sensual pleasures. Our minds are insatiable. Even if there were 2 mountain ranges the size of the Himalayas, totally gold, it wouldn't be enough for one person's sensual desires, so there's never going to be any satisfaction. Then there's image of the dog gnawing on a chain of bones from which all the meat has been removed. Gnawing, 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 getting no nourishment at all, just a little bit of taste, the taste of its own saliva. That's what sensual fantasies are, your own saliva, basically. If you get attached to a particular sensual pleasure, you're going to have to put yourself in a position where it can be taken away from you. The image is of a hawk that has a piece of meat. It takes off, and other hawks, crows, and kites take after it to pull the meat away. If it doesn't let go, it's going to get mangled. Sensuality is like carrying a torch against the wind. You burn yourself with the sensual fantasies. A drop of honey on the blade of a knife. There's a little bit of sweetness, but a lot of danger. So the Buddha has you reflect that if you're devoted to sensual pleasures, and you're fascinated with thinking about them, you're putting yourself in a really weak position. You're going around with borrowed goods, and the owners can take them back at any time. You're in a tree with a lot of fruit, but somebody else wants that fruit as well, and they're willing to cut the tree down, even as you're in it. There are disadvantages all around, both inside and out, in a life devoted to sensuality. It's when you can think in those terms that you're willing to find pleasure of a non-sensual kind. The Buddha is not saying that when you practice renunciation you should simply do without. He provides you with an alternative pleasure, the pleasure of right concentration, the pleasure of jhana. The absorption you get in when you're fully inhabiting the body, the sense of ease that comes with the breath, the sense of fullness that comes with the breath as you allow it to spread throughout the whole body. When you have this alternative pleasure, you learn how to cultivate it, enjoy it, and then you can use it for getting the mind into even deeper concentration. You hear people say, watch out for the dangers of jhana. The pleasures are so attractive that you just get sucked in. But the Buddha very rarely talks about the dangers of jhana. There's one passage where he compares it to having your hand on a branch that has some sap. As long as you're not willing to go beyond the practice of concentration, it's like there being sap on your hand from the branch. You're stuck. But being stuck on concentration is a minor problem compared to being stuck on sensuality. You actually need the pleasure of jhana to get away from sensuality. Otherwise, all you see are 2 alternatives, sensuality and pain. To escape the pain, you go for the sensuality. As the Buddha says, without the pleasure of right concentration, then even though you can see the drawbacks of sensuality, you're still going to go back to sensual pleasures. So you've got to cultivate this sense of well-being inside, the pleasure of form, even though it feels very embodied. I know a lot of people say, what's the difference? This feels very sensual. It's different. The sensuality of the body relates to your tactile sensations, the things you touch. This is something totally inward that has none of the drawbacks of sensuality. It's not intoxicating, and it doesn't require that you do anything unskillful. That's one of the other areas where you have to exercise restraint with sensual pleasures. There are some sensual pleasures that require you to break the precepts in order to get them. You have to say no to those. The same goes for sensual pleasures that require that you get into conflict, to develop unskillful mental attitudes. Sensual pleasures are intoxicating, and they certainly don't help you observe your mind with any clarity, whereas the pleasure of jhana is not intoxicating in that way. It doesn't require anything unskillful, and it helps you see your mind very clearly. As the Buddha said, when the mind settles in like this, you can begin to see that the concentration itself is composed of aggregates, and you can start using the perceptions of inconstancy, stress, and not self, first to pry yourself away from any thoughts of sensuality, any of the hindrances, any of the unskillful qualities ranging from wrong view up through wrong concentration. Then you turn that analysis on right concentration itself. This leads to another stage. Ajahn Fuang talked about this. He told me one night of a time when he was suffering from really bad headaches for weeks after weeks after weeks, having tried all kinds of medicine. Finally, he realized the pain was not something to try to run away from or to cure. The pain was something to be comprehended. So he sat up and watched the pain. From the way he described the experience, it sounded like stream entry for him. He said one of the realizations that came afterwards was that once you've been away from the senses, you come back to the senses and you realize just the fact of engaging in the experience of the senses is painful in and of itself. Even the pleasures are painful. You open your eyes, bap, and there's stress. Which made me think of that sutta where the Buddha is talking about the leper. The leper cauterizes his wounds because it feels good. His relatives and friends take him to see a doctor, and the doctor is able to cure him of his leprosy. Once he's cured, then he looks back at the other lepers. Does he envy them their burning sticks with which they cauterize their wounds? Not at all. If someone were to take him into a pit of burning embers, would he willingly go? No. Why? Because the fire is hot, scorching, painful to the touch. So the Buddha asks Maganjya, the person he's talking to, is the fire painful only now that the leper has been cured, or was it already painful to begin with? It was painful to begin with. It's simply that the leper had distorted perceptions. As the Buddha said, it's the same way once you've seen the deathless. You see that your previous perceptions of sensuality were distorted. You realize that even the pleasures of the senses are painful because you found something so much better. So, when you're dealing with sensual pleasures, it's a matter of learning how to exercise proper restraint, restraining yourself from any pleasures that would give rise to more unskillful qualities that would require you to break the precepts. When you're dealing with sensuality, it's a matter of seeing the drawbacks, developing an alternative absorption for the mind, getting the mind absorbed in the sense of the body as you feel it from within, and finally changing your perception of sensuality altogether, so that you no longer miss it. That's when the mind really is free. Up to that point, we can be slaves to sensuality to a greater or lesser degree, but it's important that you realize that once you've gone beyond it, you don't miss it. It's not a case of deprivation. You hear the word renunciation, and it sounds like you're being pulled away from your pleasures and offered scraps of old bread and a little bit of stale water, prison food. But it's the other way around. You begin to realize that the pleasures of sensuality are prison food. The pleasure of jhana is nourishing, healthy food. The image in the canon is of different types of food all the way up to ghee, honey, and butter. And then there's the point where the mind goes beyond the need even for that kind of food. When it no longer needs to feed, that's when it's free. Smart about lust. July 10th, 2023. A few years after I came back to the States, a friend of mine from college who was teaching at a college in the Midwest invited me to speak to his classes. He was a professor of comparative religion, and he wanted to expose his students to a real Buddhist monk. The school was something of a party school, so I didn't expect much in terms of the students' response. He told me afterwards that one of the responses that the students gave was that they were surprised to see a monk who was fairly intelligent and had an active mind. One woman said she expected monks to be subhuman, and she was surprised to see that I actually thought for myself. That's a fairly standard reaction among people who are attached to their passions, and particularly attached to their lust, that anyone who's not giving in to lust, not following a life of lust, is a loser. All of the glamour, all the prestige, and all the intelligence seem to be on the side of those who give in to their lust, the pride that you're able to think thoughts of sensuality, think of the things and people you desire, invent lots of different scenarios for what you might want, and figure out how to get what you want out of the people you desire. There's a belief that there's a fair amount of intelligence and creativity that goes with that. The people who don't follow their lust tend to be little goody two-shoes, not all that bright. They may be wise in the sense of the wisdom of books that have little wise phrases, one on each page, but they don't have any street smarts. They don't know how to get what they really want. The basic picture is of people who are dried up, world-weary, who simply can't get it on with other people. I must admit that when I first learned about arahants having no passion, no aversion, and no delusion, their lives seemed awfully dry. But then I met Ajahn Fuang and other masters of the forest tradition, and the impression I came back with was totally different. these were the people who were really sharp. They had learned how to see that their lust, their greed, and their aversion were really dumb. They had seen through these things. They had figured them out. So an important part of learning to overcome your lust is just that, seeing that it requires intelligence to overcome it, and that the people who give in to lust are the ones who are dumb. When you change your perspective that way, it tips the balance. Now, we have to admit that our defilements are pretty clever in their way. They do figure out ways of getting what they want in the short term. And they're especially smart in making us feel that we're smart in giving in to them. They're like websites affiliated with political parties. We all know deep down inside someplace that the political parties don't care much about most people. All they care about is their wealthy donors. But you go to their websites and they'll tell you the latest put-downs of the other side. They're in jokes about the other side, so that you feel that you're on their side, they're on your side. And we willingly allow ourselves to be duped this way. You have to realize that the real intelligence comes in learning how not to be duped, learning how to figure out why greed, aversion, delusion, and lust have such power over the mind. Where does their power come from? If you've learned to see this as an intelligent quest, that a really good use of your intelligence would be to understand how to get past these things, that's half the battle right there, because it does require figuring things out. We're not here to just watch things come and go and say, oh, yes, they come and go. And the pleasure of lust doesn't last very long, so I might as well give it up. That's like saying, the pleasure of eating doesn't last very long, so I might as well just stop eating. If you don't have something better to feed on, you just keep coming right back to eat some more. The first step in overcoming lust is learning how to develop good, strong concentration, realizing that there is a sense of well-being that can be immediate, visceral, right here, as you spread feelings of ease and refreshment through the body simply by the way you breathe, simply by the way you relate the rest of the body to the areas where it's obvious that you're breathing, until you begin to see that, yes, the whole body is breathing. That gives you some support. But then, the rest of the work is figuring things out. You see this in the teachings of the Forest Ajahns. As I've said many times, during my time with Ajahn Fuang, there were a lot of things he wouldn't explain. He'd tell me that I was doing things wrong when I was arranging things in his hut or arranging a construction project in the monastery. But when I was doing something wrong, he wouldn't say what the right way was to do it. It was up to me to figure it out. As he said, his purpose was to get me used to figuring things out for myself. If everything were to be handed to me on a platter, ready-made, ready-solved, I wouldn't develop any intelligence. I wouldn't get practice in solving problems on my own. After all, when you're off meditating on your own in the forest, there are a lot of times when something comes up and there's nobody you can run to. You have to figure things out right then and there. The Buddha gives you some questions to ask. When lust comes, where does it come from? He uses the word origination. What is its origination? The origination isn't the object outside, it's something inside the mind itself. There's a thirst, a sense of lack, and then there's the thought that, well, I could fill in this lack with thoughts of sensuality. Even if I can't get what I want, I can fantasize. Of course, fantasizing leads the mind to think more and more in terms of actually acting on those fantasies. So what's the origination? Can you pinpoint it? And then, how does it pass away? In other words, what happens in the mind that makes it pass away? Does it remain constant or does it come and go? There are times when you'll notice that it's coming and going, but the fact that it comes back makes you believe that it must be deeply entrenched. Yet maybe that's not the case. It can last only for a certain amount of time and then it stops. But then there's something in the mind that wants it back. What is that something? What is that desire? This is where you start looking into the allure. What do you find attractive about lust? This, on the one hand, is why we have the analysis of the 32 parts of the body, starting with your own body because that's the body you're most familiar with. But also, as the Buddha said, it's the one you're most attracted to. Ask yourself, what in there is really all that attractive? You take it apart, part by part, and there's basically nothing. So if this body isn't attractive, how can you assign attractiveness to another body? It's the same sort of stuff. You have a digestive system with all the digestive juices and the things that come out from digestion. Well, the other person has all that too. What's the big deal? Then you dig a little bit deeper, and you realize it's not necessarily the object that has the allure. There's your role as someone who can think up these thoughts, who, in your fantasies, is clever enough to get somebody else attracted to you. There's not just lust operating there, there's a lot of pride. And as I said earlier, there's that sense of intelligence. I can figure this out, how to get what I want. But then what do you really get? This is where you have to think about the drawbacks. As the Buddha said, there is a happiness that can come through getting past your passion, past your sensuality. The first step, as I said, is with the concentration. But then there's a higher well-being, happiness, pleasure. The Pali word sukha covers all of that comes with the deathless. Everyone who's attained the deathless says, "How stupid I was not to go for this." That's why people who gain genuine awakening don't become proud over the fact of their awakening, because they've seen how stupid they were for so long. So hold that in mind as an ideal. You haven't seen the third noble truth yet, but that's the whole purpose of the Buddhist teaching, the Four Noble Truths. There is that possibility for the cessation of suffering. And it's not just a blank lack of suffering, it's a very positive well-being. Anything that stands in the way of that has a lot of drawbacks. This is why we bring out the perceptions of inconstancy, stress, and not self to help underline the drawbacks of your fantasies so that you can develop dispassion for them and gain release, escape from them. The Buddha compares sensuality to a fetter. It's like being in prison. Your defilements have managed to make the prison nice enough so that you feel like you're actually pretty clever being there, figuring out how to score a few nice things to decorate your cell. You even think that being lustful makes you attractive, so you're attractive in your prison. But it's a prison nonetheless. When you get past it, you've escaped. You're free. And now you realize how much you were oppressed before you got out. So you have to change your allegiance. The part of the mind that thinks you're smart for indulging in sensuality has to be shown, no, that's the dumb side. The smart side, the glamorous side, is what can figure lust out and get past it. Try to be active in taking this as a challenge. Why is it that I fall for these things? Why is it that they keep having power over me? There was a famous French intellectual who decided to do a history of sexuality. It was going to be a multi-volume series, but after doing a couple of years of research on it, he finally decided sex was the most boring topic of all. It sounded cool in the beginning, but it's just the same stuff over and over again. Whatever variety there is in it gets repetitive pretty fast. But freedom from sensuality, there's no boredom there at all. So see it as a challenge. There'll be setbacks, but just make yourself up for the challenge. Tell yourself that this is a good use of your intelligence. And every time you come out victorious, don't listen to the voices that say, well, you're going to give in again tomorrow, so why bother? Regard each little victory as important, because the victories can add up. You keep using your insights. When the insights don't work, you keep trying to figure out new ones, new approaches. That's a really worthwhile use of your intelligence. The intelligence that goes into sensuality and lust is pretty worthless. You're taking a good talent and trashing it. Appreciate the intelligence of renunciation and make it your sport. You're not just being wise in the sense of little books of wise sayings. You're developing street smarts of a different sort, street smarts for the noble path. And there's a real satisfaction in seeing these things through. Nobility is the best policy. October 15th, 2023. We repeat the terms, noble truth, noble eightfold path, to the point where the word noble seems to lose all of its meaning. It's good to stop and think about what it does mean. Part of its meaning comes from the context, what the Buddha described as the noble search for happiness. Instead of searching for happiness in things that age, grow ill, and die, things that will leave us or that we will leave, we search for happiness in what doesn't age, doesn't grow ill, doesn't die. In other words, we search for a happiness that doesn't let us down. And it requires that we take a noble attitude toward our suffering instead of blaming other people, blaming the stars, or blaming the creator of the universe. We don't blame, We just try to understand where it comes from. We realize that it comes from within us. The suffering itself is our clinging, and it's caused by our craving. When we understand suffering that way, we're taking a noble attitude toward it. The same with the path. It's a path of practice in which we take responsibility for our suffering and for putting an end to it. We realize that we've been making mistakes. We see our mistakes, admit our mistakes, and the foolish ways we've been looking for happiness, causing a lot of unnecessary suffering for ourselves and for others. So we take a noble attitude toward the whole problem of suffering. The important thing is that taking the noble attitude works. It's not just empty noble ideas or vague noble sentiments. It's pragmatic. When you take a grubby attitude toward happiness, just grasping whatever you can, that's what doesn't work. It leads to more misery. If you take the noble attitude and use it to direct your actions, your search really does lead to something satisfactory. I've been thinking about this because yesterday I gave a talk to a group in Brazil on the topic of fear and anxiety. In particular, I talked about how to overcome fear and anxiety by recognizing that some fears really are worth fearing and others are not. I framed the issue in the context of rebirth. If you look at all the many lifetimes you've been through, you see again and again and again that the things you love, the things you hold on to, get taken away from you, or you leave them. Things like wealth, your health, your relatives, your family. The question is not so much whether you'll be separated from them. You will be separated from them. The question then becomes, how do I get the most out of them before the separation? And here, getting the most out of them means getting both the most happiness and the most goodness. Think of Ajahn Chah's image of the broken cup. He picked up a good cup one day and told his listeners, "This cup is already broken." Then he explained himself, saying that you know the cup is going to break someday, but this doesn't mean that you use it casually or carelessly. You realize that you can get some good out of the cup, so you take care of it. But there will come a day when it breaks, and you shouldn't be surprised. The fact that you've used it well means that you don't get torn up with regret when it's broken. The fact that you've cared for it means that you don't have to blame yourself when it breaks. In that way, you engage with the cup in a way that leads to the least amount of suffering. It's the same with your wealth, with your health, with your relatives. As the Buddha said, loss of wealth, loss of health, loss of your relatives is relatively minor compared to loss of right view and loss of your virtue. But he doesn't say that these things are totally worthless or that you should treat them carelessly. After all, you can use your wealth to develop the perfection of generosity. You don't have to give it all away. In fact, he doesn't recommend giving it all away. He says you use it to provide for your own enjoyment, for the enjoyment of your family, to put some away for the future, but then also to give it, to be generous with it. The day will come when you don't have any wealth, when it's taken away for one reason or another. But then, when you look back at the time that you did have it, you realize that you got good use out of it, particularly as you used it to develop the perfection of generosity. You've got an inner wealth now that, as the Thais say, can't be burnt by fire, can't be washed away by floods. You've made a good exchange. The same with your health. The Buddha recognizes that health is very useful for the practice. When the body gets weak, it's more difficult to practice. It's not impossible, but when the body is strong, it's a lot easier to put in the effort that's required, so you look after the body. In the Vinaya, the monks' rules, there's a very large section devoted to medical care. The Buddha recognized that some illnesses respond to medicine and others don't. When the medicines are available, use them. Think of that story about Ajahn Mun that Ajahn Fuang told. When there was a monk who was sick and there was no medicine, if the monk asked for medicine, Ajahn Mun would scold him. He'd say, "What kind of meditator are you? Use your discernment to deal with the pain, to deal with the suffering." But if there was medicine and the monk refused to take it, Ajahn Mun would scold him too. "Why are you making yourself difficult to look after?" It sounds like you'd get scolded either way, but the lesson, of course, is that you adjust your desires to be in line with what's available. If the medicine is available, use it. If it's not, learn to use whatever resources you do have. Like Ajahn Lee when he had that heart attack when he was deep in the forest, he used his breath. He used his concentration to heal himself so that he could continue practicing and teaching. So you look after your wealth, you look after your health, and you look after your relatives. You take good care of them and try to engage with them as best you can. If they're junior to you, you try to teach them. If they're senior to you, you try to help them. Make sure you have goodwill for them all the time, even when they're difficult, even when you're difficult. In that way, when the time comes to leave, there's a minimum of regret. The point here is that you know you're going to lose these things someday, but you make sure that you don't lose your virtue or your right view in trying to hang on to them. Because even as you hang on, they get taken away, and then you've lost everything. Virtue, right view, these are things you don't have to lose. You can lose them only if you abandon them. Otherwise, they're yours, so you want to maintain them. And there's a strong sense of well-being that comes with that, a strong sense of your own nobility. I explained this to the group in Brazil yesterday. The question came at the end, this all sounds very noble, but how about some real practical advice on how to deal with fear and anxiety? The question, of course, missed the whole point. Taking a noble approach to fear and anxiety is what allows you to overcome those emotions in the most effective way. Taking the noble approach is what works. Noble is practical, pragmatic. Nobility is the best policy. When you can be inspired by your behavior, there's a strong sense of well-being and confidence that comes with that. So try to take the noble attitude toward the fact that the world is swept away, and the things we love, the people we love, are going to get swept away as well. But make sure your virtue doesn't get swept away, your right view doesn't get swept away. Maintain something solid inside. A story appeared in the newspapers a while back about a young man in Iran who had been murdered. They caught the murderer, tried him, found him guilty. Apparently, under Islamic law, it's the right of the parents of the deceased to decide whether the death sentence would be carried out or not. The mother had decided that she wanted to see it carried out so that justice would be served, but she started having dreams. Her son came to her and said, Mom, don't go for revenge. Forgive the guy." As she later told newspaper reporters, she didn't want to have those dreams, but they kept coming again and again. So the day came when the decision was to be made. The guilty party was sitting in a chair with a noose around his neck. The mother goes up, slaps him in the face as hard as she can, and then takes the noose off. As she told the reporters later, she then felt a huge sense of relief. It's in this way that you can pull out of this back and forth that entangles you if you go for justice. That's how the mind can be freed. We have a story like that in the Buddhist tradition as well. There was a king and a queen whose kingdom was taken away from them by another king. So they disguised themselves and went and lived in the capital of the king who had defeated them. They had a son, and they realized after a while that the son was in danger. If anything ever happened to them, he'd probably get killed too. So they sent him off to live with relatives out in the countryside. And he would come back to visit them from time to time. One time, he came back and saw that they had been captured. They'd been tied up, their heads were shaved, and they were marched around the city to the sound of a harsh drum. He saw them. They saw him. The father said, "Don't look too far. Don't look too close, because animosity is not ended with animosity. It's ended by non-animosity." The people around were asking, "Who's he talking to? What's he saying? It doesn't make any sense." But the young son heard it. The mother and father were taken off to the south of the city, where they were drawn and quartered. Guards were placed to watch over the body pieces in case anybody wanted to perform funeral rites for the dead. Well, the young son got the guards drunk, built a pyre, cremated his parents, and then decided on revenge. He got a job in the king's elephant stables. At night he would play the lute for the elephants. Of course, the lute music didn't stay just in the stables, it wafted into the royal apartments. The king liked the sound of the lute, so he had the young flute player brought into his apartments to have him play for him. The young man played the lute as best he could, and the king said, "Okay, you stay here with me." So the young man did his best to become a trusted member of the king's personal staff. He'd get up in the morning before the king, go to bed at night after the king. The king came to trust him more and more and more. Finally, the young man was in a position where he had the king alone. The king was lying down with his head in his lap. The young man was thinking about all the mischief this king had done in killing his parents and taking the kingdom that would have been his. He pulled out his sword. Then he thought about what his father had said, so he put the sword back in the scabbard. Then he started thinking and pulled out the sword again, but then thought of what his father said. This happened 3 times. The king woke up in a fright, saying he just had a horrible dream in which the prince, the son of that king he had executed, had come after him. So the young man grabbed the king by the hair, pulled out his sword, and said, "Do you know who I am? I'm that prince." So the king begged for his life. And the young man said, "No, I beg you for my life." So they both swore that they wouldn't harm each other. In the end, the young prince married the king's daughter, which meant that he was going to take over the kingdom. And so, by not getting revenge, that huge pile of death after death after death that would have followed was ended, and both sides were freed. It's when you take the noble path that you find that it's the path that works. It's the practical path. It's simply a matter of learning how to inspire yourself that you can do it. You can be noble too. That's another one of the meanings of the noble truths and the noble path. They're ennobling. As you follow them, as you take them on, you become a noble person. It's the noble people who are truly happy, because they followed the noble path that works. The Graduated Discourse, July 22, 2022. Ajahn Fuang was orphaned at an early age, around 11, and as he said one time, he lived as a temple boy for 5 years without really listening to the Dhamma at all. Then, when he turned 16, he began to listen. He started thinking about himself. The teachings on karma told him that he must have had some bad karma. Here he was, orphaned, poor, didn't have much of a schooling. If he was going to find any happiness in life, he would have to change his ways. It was that turnaround that got him interested in practicing, and why, when he finally ordained as a monk at age 20, he was really upset when he discovered, after reading the Vinaya, that they weren't observing the Vinaya very well where he was staying. And they certainly weren't practicing meditation, which is why he was so happy to find Ajahn Lee when Ajahn Lee came the following year to Chantaburi. At that point, Ajahn Fuang took to the Dhamma like a fish to water. But he wasn't always that way. As the texts say, the mind untrained is very unpliant, it's very resistant, like the kind of wood that snaps when you try to bend it, whereas the trained mind is pliant. When you try to bend it in the right direction, it'll go that direction. The problem is that you have to train your mind. It's a matter of the mind training the mind. So how does it go from being totally unpliant to being pliant? Well, Ajahn Fuang's story gives an illustration. You have to see that you've been foolish, that you've been unskillful, that you're suffering, and then you may be willing to change. Then maybe you'll be willing to listen to the Dhamma. One of the ironies of how Buddhism has come to the West is that if you're introduced to Buddhism in college, taking a course either in Buddhism itself or in comparative religion, often the first teaching they tell you is the Four Noble Truths. Whereas, when the Buddha was teaching the Four Noble Truths, he was very careful about how he would introduce them. He often wouldn't start out with those truths. There are a few cases where he did, as with the 5 brethren, but their minds were already inclined away from sensuality. Most people, as the Buddha found, see sensuality as their only escape from pain. And as the Four Noble Truths point out, our craving for sensuality is one of the reasons why we're suffering. Clinging to sensuality is suffering in and of itself. Those teachings go against the grain. So, how do you change the grain of a person's mind? The Buddha would usually give what's called a graduated discourse or step-by-step discourse, Anupabbikata is the Pali. We're told many times in the canon that that was the kind of discourse he would give before introducing the Four Noble Truths, especially to lay people, but we don't have the text of any of those discourses. It may have been that the Buddha tailored each discourse to the needs of the person he was talking to. One of the cases was the householder, a Pali, who had been a strong supporter of the Jains and had gone one day to argue with the Buddha, thinking that he would bring greater glory to his Jain teacher by showing that even a lay disciple of a Jain teacher could defeat the Buddha. Well, he ended up getting converted. So, as the Buddha taught him the step-by-step discourse, you can imagine one way in which he would have taught it. Another case was a leper, Suppa Buddha. One day he's going through the city, and he sees a large group of people gathered. He thinks, maybe there's a food distribution, maybe I can get some food there. As he gets close, he realizes, no food distribution. It's a group of people who've come to listen to the Buddha teach the Dhamma. So he says to himself, well, I might as well listen to the Dhamma too. As the Buddha surveys the crowd, he sees that the leper is the one who's going to be able to benefit from the teaching. So he gives a graduated discourse for him, which you can imagine would be somewhat different. Even though the main outlines were the same, it would be different in the details from what he taught Apali. And of course there are the cases of the archers who were sent to kill the Buddha, and then to kill the archer who'd kill the Buddha, and then to kill those archers, then to kill those archers. He taught them all the graduated discourse, group by group, and they all gained the Dhamma after their minds were ready to hear the Four Noble Truths. So there probably were a lot of variations in the details. The general outline is that he would start with a talk on generosity, and the good that comes from generosity in this lifetime, the fact that people respect you, people love you, and you gain a sense of self-confidence. He would then talk about virtue in a similar way. People respect you. He said the wealth that comes from being virtuous tends to be solid. In other words, it doesn't fly in, but it doesn't fly out. When you go to a meeting of your fellow citizens, you're not abashed. You're not afraid that somebody might rightly accuse you of a breach of virtue, because you don't have any breaches of virtue. Then, when the Buddha saw that people were amenable to hearing about what was good about generosity, what was good about virtue, he would talk about how after death, generosity and virtue are rewarded with the pleasures of heaven. And here, it's interesting, in the canon there are a lot of suttas on generosity, there are a lot of suttas on virtue, but there's almost nothing on heaven. There are 2 big suttas on hell, but about the pleasures of heaven, the Buddha simply says, take the pleasures of a king who is loved by his subjects, who doesn't have to engage in war, who rules over a wealthy kingdom, who enjoys his wealth, and then multiply that many times, that's heaven. Now, one of the reasons the Buddha talked about these topics was that he was going to be pointing out the drawbacks of sensuality, but first he wanted people to see that, yes, he did appreciate the fact that there are pleasures in the sensual realm, and that some of those pleasures come from goodness. So it's not that he's denying the fact of the pleasures, but as he says, it's because of the pleasures of form, feeling, perceptions, fabrication, and consciousness that we're stuck on them. That's the problem. But still, he wants people to have a sense that, yes, he does appreciate that there are pleasures in life. Then, when he gets that far, he turns the tables and starts talking about the drawbacks of sensuality, even heavenly sensual pleasures. To begin with, they're not going to last forever, they're going to end. And when you've been used to food appearing when you want it to appear, and whatever pleasure you want appearing when you want it to appear, and then you fall from there, you find that pleasure is hard to find. It's a sharp fall. You also think about the mental qualities that were developed through virtue and generosity, but then they begin to get eaten away by the fact that everything is so easy for the devas, and they get so complacent. That's the problem. The very rewards for generosity and virtue eat away the goodness you developed, and you're back where you started, sometimes worse. At that point, the Buddha would see if you were ready to regard renunciation as rest, as a good thing. This comes from seeing the dangers of complacency. This is how heedfulness arises. You realize that you've been complacent all along, and you've suffered for it. How much longer do you want to suffer? It's sensing that suffering. That's what makes the mind begin to be a little bit pliant and willing to develop heedfulness. Heedfulness, of course, is the basis for the 5 strengths, and the first of the 5 strengths is conviction. There's a passage where the Buddha talks about how conviction arises out of suffering. And it's precisely in this way, you see that you've been suffering and you realize that it's because of your own actions. You can't blame other people. You were the one who fell for the pleasures that made you complacent. So you begin to realize, okay, there's something you've got to do. This is how you develop conviction in the Buddha's awakening. Maybe this is the way out. Again, conviction is not necessarily 100% sure. There's a maybe built in, but it's a maybe of a possibility. You're at the very least willing to listen to the Buddha's teachings, especially on the power of your actions, and you're willing to take them on as a working hypothesis. That's when you're ready for the Four Noble Truths. What you've done is that you think about your sensual pleasures and the mind's fascination with sensuality, its fascination for planning for sensual pleasures, fantasizing about them, and then you step back, saying, maybe that's the problem. The mind really resists, but when you have a sense of your own foolishness and the suffering you've gone through because of your foolishness, that's when you're willing to step back. That's what helps you to develop a noble attitude. When the Buddha calls the noble truths noble, there have been people who've complained, what's noble about suffering? What's noble about craving? The suffering and the craving themselves are not noble. What's noble is the attitude the Buddha has you take toward them. If we see, the clinging, that's the suffering, that's a problem, that's when we develop a noble attitude. We usually don't see our clinging as a problem at all. It's what we like to do. We're expert clingers. The same with craving. We're expert cravers. As the Buddha says, everywhere we go with craving as our friend. It whispers into our ear, and whatever it says, we tend to believe it. But now you step back and say, wait a minute, the things that I like because of my craving and clinging, the things that I hold on to most dearly, maybe I'll have to learn how to let go of them. That attitude is noble, and that's what's noble about those two noble truths. The same with the truth of the path. You say, I can't blame anyone else for my complacency. I was the one who fell for these things to begin with. I've got to do something about it. That's why the path is noble. You take responsibility for your own suffering and for putting an end to it. Think about that question the Buddha said results from suffering, results from pain, even for little children. Who knows a way or two to bring about the end of this suffering? The question itself is not too picky about what the way might be. Especially when we're children, we probably hope that somebody will just come and take the pain away for us. Like when you go running to your mother with a cut on your finger, and she blows on it to make the pain go away. That's the kind of thing we look for all too often. Somebody who'll do the work for us. As we mature, though, we begin to realize that we've got to do the work ourselves because we're the ones who were foolish enough to create the problem in the first place. That's why the path is noble. And of course it's noble in the sense that it leads beyond just putting an end to particular pains. It takes you to a dimension where there is no pain, no suffering, no stress anymore. That's when the mind is really pliant, when it's ready for the solution. But the graduated discourse is what makes the mind pliant to begin with. Now, there were cases where the Buddha may have started out on a graduated discourse and found that he could take his listeners only so far. That's why we have the talks about generosity that stop just with generosity, or the talks on virtue that stop with virtue. There were people who had trouble getting their heads even around the fact that virtue and generosity could be good. Those were the minds that were really brittle and stiff. But the Buddha would plant a seed. Maybe someday they would be able to look at themselves and see that there was something wrong in what they'd done, and they could have listened to the Buddha and could have benefited. Yet if you're wise, you'll follow the line of thought in the graduated discourse all the way through until your mind is ready for the Four Noble Truths. As the Buddha said, when you're ready to see that renunciation of sensuality would be a good thing, then it's as if your mind is like a piece of cloth that's ready for the dye. It's been cleaned, has no stains, and it can take the dye easily. Don't be the sort of person who takes just a little bit of the dye on a dirty piece of cloth, and the cloth comes out all splotchy. Try to make your mind pliant enough to listen, pliant enough to follow along. We tend to be stiff and proud of our pride, and that's why there are so many people who claim to be Dhamma teachers here in the West, but who keep on wanting to change the Dhamma. There's something about the Dhamma they hate. Some of them don't want there to be Four Noble Truths. They don't even want there to be truths, or noble even. That attitude goes nowhere. After all, here's the Buddha, who's put all that effort into finding the way, and he's offering it to us for free. Don't be the sort of person who turns him down. Table of contents. Next page. Thoughts about thinking. March 2nd, 2023. We start with thoughts of goodwill to clear the decks. Any issues you may have had with people during the day, get them out of the way, because you're trying to give the mind a place it can settle down in, right here, right now, and you don't want those attitudes to be getting in the way. If you're worried about issues in the future, remind yourself, the best way to prepare for the future is to develop your powers of mindfulness, alertness, and ardency right here, because the future is uncertain. But you do know that when you're dealing with uncertain things, unexpected things, the more mindfulness and alertness you have, the better off you'll be, so you're preparing the right tools. As for thoughts of the past, if there are any mistakes you made in the past that suddenly come thronging into the mind, remind yourself, you can't go back and change those things. The best that can be asked of a human being is to recognize a mistake as a mistake, to resolve not to repeat it, and then to develop thoughts of goodwill again, for yourself, for the person you wronged, for all beings in all directions. This helps to put things into perspective, because when you start thinking about all beings in all directions, you realize, everybody's done wrong things in the past, it's not just you. That thought gets you more and more inclined to think about all of the wrong things that could be done in the future as long as you stay in this cycle of death and rebirth, and karma, and more karma, and more karma. Maybe it'd be good to get out. How are you going to get out? Well, the exit is right here. In other words, you're learning how to think in a way that brings the mind into the present moment, where it can then put a lot of its thinking down. Now, in the beginning, you do think. After all, two of the factors of the first level of jhana are directed thought and evaluation. So you direct your thoughts here and you evaluate what's going on. You're using thinking to bring the mind to stillness. Sometimes you find that you can spend the whole hour thinking about the breath, different breath energies in the body and how you can coordinate them. If there's a pain someplace in the body, you can ask yourself, how can you use the breath to help with the pain, so that even though the pain may stay there, you don't feel so afflicted by it? Other times, it doesn't take all that much thought, and the mind will settle down and get the breath comfortable very quickly. Then you learn how to stay here. That's a different set of skills, less thinking, but a lot of vigilance. You check to see whether the mind is ready to run off anywhere else. It'll send its signals. Scientists have studied people who aren't aware of when they've made a decision. The decision comes to the surface of their minds after it's been made someplace deeper down, and the scientists often use that fact to prove that people are not really making decisions at all. The decisions are made someplace in their molecules or their nerves. But actually, their ignorance of what's going on in the mind is just a sign that their minds have lots of walls inside. They've learned how to cover up a lot of things below the surface. But if you get the mind really quiet, you can start seeing when a decision is made way before it becomes obvious, before it comes to the surface. When you can detect that, then you can make whatever adjustments are needed so that you don't go with it, either just reaffirming your original decision to stay with the breath, or making the breath more comfortable, going back and doing a little more directed thought and evaluation, or just breathing right through wherever you sense a physical correlate to that thought. Otherwise, you just watch, and you learn how to watch again and again, continually. You're like a hunter. You're waiting to see when the animals are going to come. You can't determine ahead of time when they're going to come, so you have to be ready for them at any time. Or like a sentry up in a fire tower in the forest. You have to be quiet. You have to watch. You have no idea when the fire you're watching for is going to come, but you do know you have to be ready. So develop that same kind of attitude. You're ready to watch. Maintain that. Protect what you've got. As you do this, you begin to see the mind settling down even more, even more. Then there will come times when you've had a sense that the mind is thoroughly rested and it's ready to think again. The question is, what do you think about now? Well, think about that sutta where the Buddha talks about how he got on the right path. He started dividing his thoughts into two types, those that were going to be skillful and those that were not. What does that mean? It means he wasn't looking at the content so much. He was looking at where the thoughts were coming from and where they were going. In other words, he was looking at them as processes, part of a causal chain. Now, that approach to thinking is really useful. It's in line with the Four Noble Truths. We want to see which thoughts are part of the cause of suffering and which thoughts are part of the path away from suffering. It's as if you have a factory here that's producing very erratically, sometimes good products, sometimes bad, and you're trying to figure out, why is that? Sometimes it'll require looking at the product itself to get an idea of what could go wrong. But a lot of it has to do with going back and just looking at the machinery in the factory, looking at the workers, looking at the whole process, starting from the design of the product, through the implementation, and then the final product coming out. That's what you want to investigate. What happens to the product as it goes out into the world is not the problem. The problem is, why is the quality control in the factory so bad? Can you blame it on the workers, on the designers? Can you blame it on the middle-level management, the upper-level management? Can you blame it on the materials? Can you blame it on the machinery? There's a lot to explore here. There's a lot to investigate. Investigation requires questions, of course. Just think of investigators out in the world. They have to ask questions. The people who analyze what's going wrong with a particular company have to ask questions of everybody in the company, but they have to ask the right questions. Here the Buddha gives you some guidance. This particular factory is best understood in the framework of the Four Noble Truths. There's suffering in here, and there's something causing the suffering. The Buddha gives you some indications. He doesn't just say, there is suffering. He says what it is, clinging to the 5 aggregates. Okay, what are those aggregates? How many types of clinging are there? You can read about them in the books, but how do you actually experience them yourself? How do you get a sense of how the terms in the books apply to what's going on inside you? Then there's the question, what can you do to put an end to that clinging and craving? You find that you have to take some of the things you've been clinging to and turn them into a path. There's clinging to the 5 aggregates, that's suffering. But then the 5 aggregates are involved in the path. Concentration takes all 5 of the aggregates. Your discernment is going to require perceptions and thought fabrications. So if you come across a perception, how do you know whether it's part of the problem or part of the solution? You ask some questions, you look at its behavior. This is an aspect of the Buddhist teachings that's really distinctive, looking at the behavior of those activities in the mind, the activities that we use to try to understand the world outside. Look at those activities in and of themselves, try to understand them. Try to understand the activities of the path, and have a sense of when your investigations are going off course. The Buddha mentions that there's a distinction among his teachings. There are the teachings that should be explored to see what the implications are, and there are other ones where you don't try to draw out their implications. That second category is interesting. 1. It shows that the Buddha wasn't concerned about building a view of the world in and of itself. If he were trying to develop a consistent theory about the world, everything would have to be consistent, and all the implications would have to be drawn out and explained. In some cases, he does talk about how the world works, especially how the world of the mind works. But at other times, he has you take teachings and hold on to them as tools for making a change in the mind itself, what we might call performative teachings. Like the questionnaire about things being inconstant, stressful, not self. That's meant to perform a function on your mind, to change things in your mind. That's one of those teachings where the Buddha tells people, be very careful about how far you explore the implications. When you look in the canon, you can see where the Buddha scolds people for taking some of those teachings and trying to work out the implications too far. It's usually around what are called the 3 characteristics, as in the case where one of the monks said, well, given that all feelings are stressful and all your actions creates feelings, that means all actions create stress and pain. The Buddha says, when you're talking about karma, you have to talk about the 3 kinds of feelings, pleasure, pain, neither pleasure nor pain. After all, if you tell everybody whatever you do is going to lead to pain, then why would they want to bother trying to be skillful? You've misapplied the teaching, you've worked out implications that are not useful. You've taken teachings meant to be performative, and you're trying to use them to describe. The same with the teaching, Sab Dhamma Anatta, all Dhammas are not self. Some people take that to mean, well, the Buddha must be saying that there is no self. But then he says that when anybody tries to draw that implication out of his teachings, they've gone too far, as in the case of the monk who said, if all the aggregates are not self, what self is going to be affected by the actions done by what's not self? That's a recipe for all kinds of unskillful behavior. The Buddha specifically says that the theory that you have no self is just as bad as the theory that you have a self. In other words, both of these theories can get you tied up in knots. He calls them a thicket of views, a wilderness of views. But if the mind is ready for the teaching, Sabba Dhamma Anatta, all phenomena are not self, then it really can perform its effect on the mind. It's like one of those messages you'd get in Mission Impossible. They say, read this message and then destroy it. Sabba Dhamma Anatta. The Buddha uses that partly to remind you that even if you've had an experience of the deathless, it is possible to cling to that experience as you turn it into an object of the mind. So you've got to see that that's not worth holding on to. But then the sentence itself is a Dhamma. If you were to follow it through in performing it, you'd have to abandon it too. That's when you can abandon all the aggregates, including the fabrications and perceptions that go into Sabba Dhamma Anatta. That's when you're totally free. That's a teaching meant to do something to the mind, rather than just describe things. It gets you to develop a value judgment of dispassion toward everything, but it has to come at the right time. If you're dispassionate toward everything at the beginning of the path, you abort the whole process. So thinking, especially thinking about the Dhamma, requires that you have a clear sense of how far you should go with the teachings. Some teachings you can carry all the way through in terms of their implications. Other teachings you can take only so far, because if you take them away from exactly what they say, they no longer can perform on the mind. If you try to hold on to the idea that there is no self, what does that do? It becomes a position that you have to argue over, that you have to defend against all takers. And that's certainly not going to put an end to suffering. It becomes an object of clinging for you too. But Sabba Dhamma Anatta teaches you, let go of everything else, but also let go of me. So try to be very clear about how to think about things, how to think about the Dhamma, because you do have to think. You can't just concentrate your way to awakening or jhana your way to awakening. You get the mind still, and then you have to develop not only tranquility but also insight. And insight is not just a technique where you know things. Insight is where you figure things out inside, know when to think, know when not to think, know how to think, how far to think. Know when your thinking should be descriptive, and when it should be performative. That's when you become a master of your thoughts. We've lived our lives so long with our thoughts as our masters. Now it's time to turn things around. The desire for things to be different. September 23rd, 2022. You're going to be sitting here with your eyes closed for an hour, so try to make it a pleasant experience. Take a couple of good, long, deep, in and out breaths, and ask yourself, where in that process of breathing is the potential for ease, pleasure, a sense of fullness in the body? If there doesn't seem to be much pleasure just yet, focus on the parts that are okay, but don't think that they'll have to stay just okay. Learn how to develop the potentials you have here, because the breath does have a lot of potentials. You'll find that the use of your perceptions will make a big difference. How you visualize the breath to yourself, how you pay attention to the different parts of the body, how you react to the parts of the body where there are patterns of tension. Can you focus on them in a way that begins to disperse the tension? Can you spread your awareness around so that it envelops the body and dissolves away any bits of tension here and there that otherwise would stay there because you're not aware of them or you're not paying attention to them? Ajahn Lee talks about the breath being the medium by which the medicine of alertness and mindfulness can make a difference in how you're feeling your body right now. That's one of the big lessons in concentration practice, one of the most important lessons, that you can change things. Think of how Ajahn Lee discovered this method. He'd gone into the forest, walked with another monk for 3 days to a very out-of-the-way place. They were going to spend the rain's retreat there, depending on a hill tribe village for alms. Well, a few days after they arrived, Ajahn Lee had a heart attack. As he later said, he was ready to die if he had to, but he wanted a sign. Was there a possibility that he might survive? And there were a couple of signs that indicated that, yes, he could. So he set about to see what he had to work with. He didn't have much. The diet there, from the point of view of Thai medicine, was really bad for the heart, a lot of bamboo shoots. In Thai medicine, heart attacks are basically considered a disease of the wind element, and bamboo shoots are bad for the wind element, so his food wasn't going to be his salvation. He realized he would have to work on the wind element from within. Now, he'd already seen some yogis in India, noticing how they used the breath element in their bodies to stand in single positions for long periods of time out under the sun. He had learned a little bit about that. Now he was going to explore it even further. That's how he pulled himself together. He looked at the potentials he had, saw what he could do with them, and as a result, at the end of the rains retreat, he was able to walk out 3 days to get back to civilization. He lived for another 8 years. So he didn't just say, "Oh, this is what a heart attack is like. It's like this." He didn't tell himself that the desire for things to be different was bad. He wanted to explore, what are the potentials here, to see how far they could go. This is why we have method 2 in keeping the breath in mind. It's also why we have that passage where he talks about how when you're working on concentration, you're taking what's inconstant and trying to make it constant. You're taking what's stressful and trying to make it easeful. And you take what's not under your control and see how far you can control it. You push against those 3 perceptions, and in doing so, you create a path. This is how the path works in general. You don't start with equanimity, you start with the principle of action, that your actions can make a difference. Back in medieval India, when they introduced the 4 Noble Truths in the basic textbooks for Buddhist doctrine, they would start with the 5 aggregates, move quickly to the 3 characteristics, and then get to the 4 Noble Truths. In other words, they started with a picture of reality. Reality is composed of aggregates, and the aggregates are marked by the 3 characteristics. The message of that picture was that reality is pretty much out of your control. It's not worth your while trying to exert control over it. That attitude has permeated a lot of Buddhist practice ever since. But when the Buddha introduced the 4 Noble Truths, he didn't start with the principle of reality. In fact, there are passages in the canon that make fun of teachers who, when you ask them a question about what's worth doing in life, will start with how many elements there are in the world, or whether good and bad are just social conventions, or the idea that actions are unreal. In other words, they start with a picture of reality, and then from that picture of reality, all too often the message is that human action is totally powerless. The Buddha, though, started with the power of human action. His graduated discourse, his introduction to the 4 Noble Truths, starts not with principles of reality, but with truths about actions. He talks about generosity, he talks about virtue, and the good that can come from doing these things, how you can make your life a better life when you practice these things. Of course, he's going to get to the point where the goodness of just virtue and generosity has its limitations, but even then, he doesn't tell you to just give up on action. When he then teaches the 4 Noble Truths, the most important part of the 4 Noble Truths is the path, a path of action that will lead to the end of action. But it is a path of action. It's instructions on how you make things better, how you take that desire for things to be different and you don't snuff it out, you train it. You realize that simply wishing for things to be different is not going to get you there, but it can motivate you to do the things that will get you there. One of the definitions of suffering is not getting what you want. In other words, being born and not wanting to die. You can't get that simply by wishing. But there is a path, the path of virtue, the path of concentration, the path of discernment, that will get you where you want to go. It'll take you to a different place from where you are right now, a place where there is no death because there is no birth. What's important is that you can make a difference, and you shouldn't try to deny your desire to make a difference or for things to be different. Instead, simply learn how to train that desire. After all, that kind of desire is one of the bases of success. It's part of right effort. And with each of the skills you learn on the path, you find that you really can make a difference. Now again, you do run into limitations. Ajahn Lee couldn't make himself live forever. During his 8 remaining years, he had heart trouble again and again. For a few years he was able to pull himself together. There came a point, though, when he couldn't, but by then he had other things that were more important that he could do. Which means when you start thinking about equanimity, remember the Buddha's pattern for teaching equanimity. You don't just go straight to equanimity. Think of those different lists that talk about developing equanimity. You develop equanimity through insight. You develop equanimity through concentration. You develop equanimity as part of the Brahma Viharas. Equanimity comes after you've made a difference in your mind, after you've found a sense of well-being, the potential for well-being in each of those activities. The equanimity of insight comes after the joy of insight. You gain insight to things that have been burdening the mind, and you realize that you don't have to carry those burdens. There's a joy that comes with that. The equanimity of concentration. First you go through the first, second, and third jhanas, rapture, pleasure, more pleasure. Pleasure gets more and more refined. Only then do you settle into the equanimity of the fourth jhana. And then the Brahma Viharas. You start with a sense of well-being that comes from goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, when you realize that you don't mean ill to anyone at all. Your heart is wide. You have compassion for all beings, including those who have harmed you. You have empathetic joy for others, with no sense of narrow resentment. The heart finds joy as it gets more and more expansive. Then you develop equanimity, because after all, no matter how much you wish for all beings to be happy, it's not going to happen. Not everyone wants to do the work involved in being truly happy. There does come a point where you have to say, that's as far as I can go in that direction, but you've already gone pretty far. The same with the practice of concentration. You stop the directed thought and evaluation when you realize that no matter how much more you talk to yourself about the breath, it's not going to get any better. It's good enough as it is, so you settle in. Then you find that the rapture that comes from settling in like that becomes oppressive. It's too strong. You want something that's better, something more refined, so you drop the rapture. You get the mind to the point where there's just pleasure in the body, equanimity in the mind. Then you find that even the need to breathe in and breathe out feels oppressive. Your sensitivities have been heightened at that point, so you allow the body just to be there. Because your awareness fills the body, breath energy fills the body, and the mind is very still, the body doesn't need to breathe, and you don't have to force it. So you come to equanimity with a sense of fullness. If you go straight to equanimity before you've done anything, it becomes defeatist. Equanimity has to follow on joy for it to be the large-hearted equanimity that's a good part of the path. But then you see that it, too, has its limitations. This has been the pattern all along. You saw the limitations of generosity and virtue, now you begin to see the limitations of concentration. But if things stopped there, it would be like the serenity prayer. May I have the courage to change what I can change, the patience to accept what I can't, and the wisdom to tell the difference. But there's more. When you take the powers of discernment you've developed as you've been getting the mind to settle down and you've gained an understanding of the mind, its tendency to run off to hindrances, and how you can put a stop to that tendency, and then all the processes that go into creating this state of concentration, developing the potentials you have in the breath, in the body, in the mind, in your perceptions, then you begin to see, oh, this too is fabricated. This too has its limitations. Is there something better? And the Buddha's answer is yes. And you find that opportunity within yourself. That's when you realize that the practice is not just a matter of running up to limitations and accepting them. You've seen where the limitations are everywhere else in the world, and that funnels your interest into the deathless, because prior to that, the mind seems to want to do anything else, go anywhere else, but to the deathless. So you've got to show it that there are going to be limitations no matter where you go. Even the good things you do with generosity, virtue, concentration, and discernment have their limitations. Maybe it's time that you open up to the possibility of something better. That's why the Buddha is steering you in this direction. You learn to accept those limitations because you're going to go to some place that's unlimited. That's the message from the beginning, all the way through to the end. The power of your actions, the power of human action based on that desire for things to be different. You don't snuff out the desire, you don't deny it. You learn how to make it skillful. You learn how to focus it on skillful actions, and you pursue the different skills of generosity, virtue, concentration, and discernment to see how far they can take you. As in that image of the relay chariots, the first one can't take you all the way, but it can deliver you to the next one, which can take you further, to the next one, which can deliver you to the next one, which can take you even further. You don't stop with equanimity, because you see that it, too, is fabricated, and there must be something better. You finally reach the chariot that takes you to where you want to go, a place with no limitations at all. It's the end of desire. It's the end of wanting things to be different, not because you've told yourself that it's a bad desire, but because you've gotten to a place that's totally satisfactory and couldn't be improved if it were different. I saw recently someone quoting Ajahn Mahabua saying that Nibbana is a place of enough. Their idea was that teaching people to have a sense of enough would take them to Nibbana right now. That's got things backwards. When you get to Nibbana, then things are enough because they really are enough, because you've made a difference. You've seen how far desire can take you. It can deliver you to the threshold of where you want to go. So don't look down on desire. That was another one of Ajahn Lee's lessons. It's because of our desire to practice, our desire for true happiness, that we're going to be able to find it. Just take that desire seriously. It's going to require skill, many skills, but they're skills that we can all develop by nurturing the potentials we already have.